Corrado?
Dear colleagues, good morning or good afternoon, and welcome to the last module on nutrition. I leave immediately the floor to Professor Virgilio Carpelli and Professor Joseph Noy. They will chair the webinar, and I will introduce today's speakers, Professor Neena Modi, whom I sincerely thank for her participation. Please, Virgilio.
Dear friends and friends of the UENPS and the Hippocrates, welcome to this fifth module. It's a great pleasure for me to open this first module. And as previous module, you know, is based on 3 days. And this is unfortunately the last module on nutrition. But today I have really the privilege of introducing the first speaker, which is a renowned neonatologist, a senior neonatologist, and she is Neena Modi. Neena has several titles, and I like simply to cite or remember you. She's the president of the British Medical Association. She's the immediate past president of the Medical Women Federation and past president of Royal College of Pediatric and Child Health, and many more titles. There are many more titles, many more roles. But in order to save time, I like really to give the microphone, the podium, whatever it's called, to Neena. And she will talk today on what is optimal growth. Please, Neena, it's a pleasure to have you with us today.
Thank you very much, Virgilio. That was a very kind and generous introduction. I'm delighted to be with you. Thank you for the invitation to contribute to Hippocrates. Hello to all the participants from around the world. I'm going to share my screen now. Please tell me whether this is showing all right. Do you see the screen okay?
Yes.
Excellent. So thank you again for inviting me. The Hippocrates series of teaching is renowned throughout the world, and it's always a pleasure to take part in one of these modules. And it was a particular pleasure to be asked to speak on this very important topic of preterm growth. Now, I hope that you will all take part in the discussion that we will have afterwards, because I'm going to introduce you to some concepts which bear reflecting about. I would like you to consider them very carefully. I'm not necessarily going to give you clear answers, but I hope I'm going to stimulate you to think about how we can find answers to these problems in the future. So I'm going to talk very briefly about the history of growth monitoring, also the nature of current preterm growth charts, present to you some new preterm weight data, and then end with, first of all, what tentative practice recommendations we can make, and finally with some reflections for where we need to go to improve our practice in the future. So the first point is to just give you a little bit of the history of growth monitoring. And most pediatricians know that the measurements, the regular measurement of children and the plotting of the measurement of children on a graph was attributed to a French nobleman, Count Philibert de Montbéliard, who is said to have measured his son every 6 months from birth to the age of 16. And you will see in the top left-hand panel, this boy's height as he grew older. And on the bottom left-hand panel, his height velocity, his height gain per year, his height velocity, showing the decline in early childhood and then the abrupt rise in the prepubertal period, and then again the decline. And these data were published by Georges Louis Leclerc, who was a friend of Count Philibert, and they were published in this biological textbook, the Histoire Naturelle. And that's believed to be one of the first instances of pediatric growth monitoring. But then as the years went on, growth monitoring began to use for different purposes, other purposes. And in adult practice, the original purpose of anthropometry, the measurement of man, was administrative. It was to classify individuals. For example, young men were measured to assess their fitness for conscription into the armies around the world. And if you were below a certain weight or a height, you were considered unfit to be conscripted into the army. In the United States, slaves were measured to assess their worth in the marketplace. And then also in the 19th century, interest in eugenics led to scientists such as Francis Galton to use anthropometry to quantify physical differences between the races on the assumption that certain patterns represented superiority. So these were some of the original reasons of growth monitoring. But where did pediatrics come in? Well, again, in the 19th century, society began to appreciate the damage that was done through child labor. And here is a picture of a young child, typical of the age, who was shelling oysters. And this growing societal distaste of child labor led to the science of auxology, in other words, the study of growth, where growth was used as a measure of health. And in other words, in pediatric practice, it became to be recognized that the ideal pattern of weight gain or of growth is that which reflects growth in healthy children. Now, of course, this is a conceptual framework that is very good for pediatric practice, but it's somewhat problematic for neonatal care because, of course, evolution did not prepare for preterm birth. And it's only with modern medicine and modern medical methods that extremely and very preterm babies are able to survive and we hope to thrive. So this conceptual framework of the ideal pattern of growth, one which reflects growth in healthy children, is very difficult to apply in preterm practice. But the general rule, I think, that we can all accept is that today growth monitoring is used as an indicator of nutritional, health, and social problems as well. And I will come back to that point about social problems later on in my talk. Let me turn now, though, to talk about growth charts. So first of all, some rather boring explanations, if you'll bear with me, just to remind you that a growth reference is a statistical summary of anthropometry by age and sex in groups of infants who represent a particular group in a particular region at a particular time. And a growth reference, it describes how infants grow. It describes how this group of infants who are defined by time or by place or by other characteristic, it simply describes how they grow. And it simply can be used to determine if other children grow in the same way as the reference group. So there is no suggestion that this is good growth or bad growth. It's simply a reference against which you can compare an individual child. A growth standard, however, is the same as a growth reference, except that the sample is selected from a healthy population. And the assumption is that this represents an optimal pattern of growth. And as I said previously, this assumption is really quite difficult to apply to preterm practice, but we'll come on to that. And then the lines in growth charts represent a median with symmetrical centiles above, for example, the 3rd, 10th, and 25th centiles, and similarly below, or the mean with standard deviation spacings, or some sort of mixture of the two, such as lines spaced 2/3 of a standard deviation apart, which correspond roughly to the 2.39th, 25th, and so on centiles. So before we start to look at growth charts in detail, let me consider some prevalent views in pediatric practice. One very prevalent view, which you will hear a lot of people referring to, is the view that a preterm baby should grow like a fetus. Now, this practice appears to have arisen by an opinion voiced by the American Academy of Pediatrics way back in 1977, which they acknowledged was non-evidence-based. And today, it's important to note that this statement is very variably interpreted. The view that's also prevalent is that weight below the 10th centile, or a weight Z-score below -1.3 at around 36 to 40 weeks post-menstrual age, constitutes postnatal growth restriction or postnatal growth failure. Now, I find these terms difficult because they imply suboptimal growth status, and they give credence to exhortations to try and force a baby onto a particular growth centile. and they give credence to exhortations to practice what's sometimes called aggressive nutritional practice, and also they promote rapid weight gain. And again, I will come back to that in a moment. There's also the view that clinicians should strive to ensure that a baby who's born preterm reaches their birth centile by the time they get to full term. Now, Tanis Fenton, who is a member of this group and who will be speaking during this module, has published some very, very interesting data recently showing that anthropometry at full term is not predictive of neurodevelopment. Many people say you should strive to ensure that a baby reaches birth centile by term because they say that slower growth is associated with poorer neurodevelopment. But as scientists, I would ask you to remember that association should not be taken to mean causation. And as I say, anthropometry at full term does not necessarily predict later neurodevelopment. And the final prevalent view, which we particularly see in randomized controlled trials and in meta-analyses, is the view that faster weight gain is always better weight gain. This may not be the case. There are no clinical trials to date targeting faster third trimester postnatal weight gain that have shown sustained neurodevelopmental benefit. And as I will also come back to saying a little bit later on, faster weight gain may be dangerous as too slow weight gain. But let's turn now to the implications of current preterm growth charts. And all of you will be used to using charts such as these. There are a number in use around the world. Many countries have their own growth charts. I have just put up the one that we use in the UK, but there are very many such charts in use around the world. Now, preterm charts are usually developed from cross-sectional data from infants born preterm. They are not derived from longitudinal data following the weight, the length, the head circumference of babies born preterm. They are developed from cross-sectional data. In other words, they are not growth charts. They are birth measurement charts. And they were never intended to be used as growth charts. However, many clinicians do use them at growth charts, and herein lies a few problems. I'll come back to that point again in a moment. Charts do exist depicting fetal growth estimated from serial ultrasound scans, but in both these cases, the curves self-evidently plot a trajectory for a preterm baby to reach the size of a full-term baby by the time of full term. And that has some serious implications, which I would like you to be aware of. The first thing to bear in mind is that babies born preterm have usually suffered some degree of growth restriction. Now, if you think back to my comments that in pediatric practice, we know very well that poor growth can be due to either nutritional reasons or health reasons, or, as I say, in pediatric practice, societal reasons. But a baby born preterm has usually suffered some degree of health impairment, or their mother has suffered some degree of health impairment, which is the reason why the baby has been born preterm. And when you consider that health issues do adversely impact on growth, it is not surprising that babies born preterm, what we see here listed as the neonatal standard, babies born preterm weigh less than the equivalent fetus in utero who remains in utero. So you'll see that the fetal standard for these very and extremely preterm babies is always more than the neonatal standard. This shows you that preterm babies usually weigh less than equivalent aged babies who remain in utero. And this is important because we need to remember that the most of the babies who we care for in our neonatal intensive care units have suffered some degree, to greater or lesser extent, but some degree of growth restriction. Now, if you combine this with the way in which we use growth charts, let's see what happens. So here is a typical set of growth curves. Weight is on the y-axis, postmenstrual age in weeks is on the x-axis. The solid lines are the estimated fetal weights, and the dotted lines are actual birth weights of babies born at different gestation age. And we have a hypothetical baby here born at 28 weeks gestation, and you can see that this baby sits on what is the 10th centile for the preterm reference, depicting some degree of growth restriction. Now, I ask you a question. Do you want to achieve the weight this baby would have had if he or she had remained in utero? Or do you want to achieve the weight velocity this baby would have had in utero? I'm going to pause just for a moment to ask you to reflect on that. Do you want to achieve the weight this baby would have had if she had remained in utero? Or do you want to achieve the weight velocity the baby would have had if she had remained in utero? If you want to achieve the weight the baby would have had in utero, then weight gain will exceed fatal weight velocity, so that the baby will have achieved at or before term the weight of a baby who remained in utero or who was born at full term. So you can try and achieve fast catch up to the 10th centile, from the 10th centile of this birth weight to the 10th centile of fetal weight, or you might want to do it more slowly so that the baby achieves the weight she would have had she born at or near full term. But if you want to achieve intrauterine weight velocity, then baby will inevitably weigh less at full term than a full term counterpart, because you will be following this blue trajectory. So these are really, really important fundamental differences that it is really worth understanding, because the problem for us in neonatal medicine is that we do not know which is the better option. The optimal pattern of postnatal weight gain following very preterm birth is one that leads to optimal long-term health outcomes, and this is unknown. And I'd also ask you to bear in mind that despite enormous variation in nutritional practice around the world, the overwhelming majority of babies have a final height and weight in adult life that is within the population range. There are numerous investigators from all around the world who've shown this, but I've just put up one study from Maureen Hack that was published in Pediatrics in 2003, which followed the weight and the height of babies born very preterm from birth up to the age of 20 years. She's plotted AGA babies in the grey bars and SGA babies, small for gestation age babies, in the black bars. But you will see as these children progressively grow up, more and more and more of them, until the majority of them fall within normal population ranges. And Maureen did not adjust these data for mid-parental height. Other investigators have done that. And if you do adjust final height and weight or final size for mid-parental height, then an even higher proportion of these very preterm children fall within the normal adult population ranges. So this is telling us something about the fact that these preterm individuals do seem to be following a normal predestined growth trajectory. But why am I worried about promoting faster growth? Well, over 8 decades of research in every single species studied, including human beings, shows that there is a very, very, very clear relationship between faster growth and a greater risk of chronic non-communicable diseases and shorter lifespan. And Casey Crump, who is a well-known epidemiologist working in this area, who gave a special guest lecture at the Neonatal Update last year in 2020, published a review paper, which I recommend to all of you. It was published in the Neonatal Update special edition of 2020. And he presented a review, an overview of all of the increased risks that very preterm babies are exposed to in adult life. Increased risks of hypertension, type 1 diabetes, type 2 diabetes, lipid disorders, ischemic heart disease, heart failure, chronic kidney disease, and so on, and shorter lifespans. And therefore, we should seriously ask the question, if we are always promoting more and more rapid growth, might we be exacerbating the harms, the dangers that already face our preterm population? Might we be in danger of doing more harm than good? And at this point, I want to reiterate, I am not promoting starvation. I am not promoting too slow growth, but nor am I promoting too fast growth. I'm simply saying that somewhere in the middle of these two extremes is the right pattern of growth. And at the moment, our current state of knowledge is that we do not know what this is. So let me present to you now in the last bit of my talk some new data. Excuse me. First of all, just a word about the intergrowth study. This is intergrowth 21, which has published several papers, one of which was in the Lancet Global Health in 2015. This was their preterm followed-up study. This was essentially a study that was originally designed to follow the growth of fetuses in utero. But they extended it to a follow-up study in which they wanted to map the longitudinal growth of the children in the fetal study who were born preterm. This meant that the follow-up study only included 201 preterm infants, of whom only 28 were born below 34 weeks gestation, which is, of course, the population that we are very much concerned with in neonatal intensive care units. So only 28 babies were born below 34 weeks gestation. And all the babies in this study received nutrient-enriched feeds. They were meant to receive as much as possible their own mother's milk feeds, but the prevalence of exclusive breastfeeding at 6 months was only 13%. But you can go and read this paper, and what they showed is that these children they were all healthy, they were born to mothers around the world, very different locations around the world, and what they showed that about 64 weeks post-menstrual age, these children had all caught up into the normal WHO population ranges. I'm not sure that this study tells us very much as neonatal intensivists working with babies who are below 34 weeks gestation. But nonetheless, it is an interesting and important study, and I recommend you read the paper in detail. But I'd like to move on now to some very recent data, which has recently been published earlier this year, August 2021, from my group. This is a very, very large whole population study, a descriptive study, nothing more than that, a descriptive study of all extremely preterm babies born and admitted to neonatal units in England and Wales over 2008 to 2019. And the aim was to describe changes over time in birth weights and postnatal weight gain in live-born babies in relation to their gestational age at birth and in relation to major morbidities and healthy survival. So we had whole population data from the UK National Neonatal Research Database, every single baby admitted to neonatal units in England and Wales during this period, this 12-year period. We evaluated birth weight and longitudinal weight, and we asked the question whether there had been a change over years over the 12-year period in birth weight, the change over the 12-year period in weight change from birth to 14 days, and also in weight at 36 weeks post-menstrual age, and their associated Z scores. And we also compared longitudinal weight gain in babies surviving with and without major morbidities. We adjusted birth weight for antenatal, perinatal, and demographic variables, and we also adjusted weight at 14 days and weight at 36 weeks post-menstrual age for relevant postnatal variables. So what did we find? Well, first of all, we had upwards of 90,000 babies in our data set. This first set of figures shows you birth weight and birth weight Z score of very preterm babies over the 12-year period. So this is babies born less than 32 weeks gestation. On the left panel, you see birth weight on the y-axis, and on the x-axis birth year. And in the right-hand panel, you see birth weight Z score on the y-axis, and again, birth year on the x-axis. And you will see that the mean birth weight of babies over this 12-year period has remained relatively unchanged. And this suggests that obstetric practice is not altered over this 12-year period to the earlier delivery of babies with more marked degrees of intrauterine growth restriction. However, what we did show is that the mean Z score for birth weights, if you look at the y-axis here, the mean birth weight Z score was consistently negative in comparison with the reference range. Now, our reference range in the UK derives from babies born in the 1980s and 1990s. And this suggests the very preterm infants weigh less now than they did in the 1980s and 90s, which is in keeping with gradually over time a greater likelihood of delivery and survival of babies with greater degrees of growth restriction. What about change in weight and weight Z-score between birth and 14 days? Well, over the 12-year study period, you will see that weight loss over the first 2 postnatal weeks decreased. In other words, weight at 14 days, the change in weight at 14 days, you'll see that it's much greater. And this is in keeping with the fact that our babies over the years have had a reduction in the amount of early postnatal weight loss, which is in keeping with their reduced illness severity and the improvements we've made in providing early nutritional support. And what about weight and weight Z-score at 36 weeks postmenstrual age? And we chose 36 weeks postmenstrual age, by the way, because following on from this point, as you know, babies are progressively discharged from neonatal care, and we were therefore losing the healthy babies, with the babies who are more unwell remaining in the neonatal unit. So we chose to cut off at 36 weeks postmenstrual age. And you'll see that over the 12-year period, the mean weight at 36 weeks postmenstrual age has increased by an average of about 130 grams. Again, in keeping with what we know, that babies are going home now weighing more than they did in previous years. But what about longitudinal postnatal weight gain in very preterm babies surviving without major morbidity? Well, this confirms a smaller study that we published some years ago. Here we have about 45,000 babies who survived to 36 weeks postmenstrual age without any major morbidity. So no retinopathy of prematurity, no severe necrotizing enterocolitis, no severe brain injury, no bronchopulmonary dysplasia. So survived without major morbidity. The colored lines show the babies of born at different gestational ages, from 22, 23 up to 31 weeks gestation. You will see all the babies show an initial period of weight loss, again, which we know about. This is normal physiological weight loss. And then around about 32 to 33, 34 weeks gestation, weight gain stabilizes at a consistent velocity. These lines are parallel around 34 weeks gestational age. And show a gain in weight of about 16 to 25 grams per day, regardless of what gestational age group these babies came from. What about babies who had major morbidities? Well, what we showed is that weight gain differs from very early on between babies who survived with and without major morbidity, and between babies who survived and who died. So the blue lines show, for each of these graphs, the blue lines show babies who survived without any major morbidity. And the red lines show, first of all, babies who survived with bronchopulmonary dysplasia, with surgical necrotizing enterocolitis, severe brain injury, treated retinopathy of prematurity, and the babies who died before 36 weeks postmenstrual age. And you will see that for BPD, for surgical NEC, for treated retinopathy of prematurity, and for babies who go on to die, the lines diverge from very early on. They diverge before the onset of the disease. And you can see the same thing with the Z-scores, but it's not as clear as you can see with the longitudinal weights. So this again tells us, this slide tells us, again, what we know from normal pediatric practice, that if you're unwell in some way, you are not going to grow terribly well. You're not going to put on weight. And so it's a reminder to us in preterm practice that if a baby is not growing well, it should alert us to the fact that they may be unwell for other reasons. So let me try and summarize findings so far. In this paper that we published a few months ago, we showed no evidence of change in the birth weights of very preterm babies over the last 12 years. We showed that day 14 weight increased, indicating reduced postnatal weight loss, and weight at 36 weeks postmenstrual age increased, and that these findings were stable to adjustment for a number of variables. We showed that trajectories of weight gain diverged from shortly after birth between infants who survived and who went on to die, and babies who survived with and without major morbidities. In babies who survived without major morbidity after the initial period of weight loss, weight gain stabilized along parallel centile lines below the birth centile in all gestational age groups. Boys weighed more than girls at birth, but their birth weight Z-score at birth was lower, indicating that boys were more likely to have suffered a greater degree of intrauterine growth restriction. But by 36 weeks postmenstrual age, boys weighed more than girls and had a higher weight Z-score, indicating more rapid postnatal weight gain. And this may have some bearing on the fact that boys appear more at risk of these chronic non-communicable diseases than do girls. And finally, at 36 weeks postmenstrual age, weight in babies without major morbidity was consistently lower than birth centile. Now, what can we infer from all of these data? Well, other studies from other countries, including the United States and Italy, have shown that preterm babies gain in weight along a lower mean centile than depicted by our current growth charts. Babies, even in the very few preterm babies in the Intergrowth 21 follow-up study, all received nutrient-enriched human milk feeds, but they also weighed less at term than babies born at full term. All of these studies from the US, from Italy, from the UK, from Intergrowth, and from elsewhere around the world, these include very diverse preterm populations and highly variable nutrient intakes. And therefore, the consistency of these findings regarding growth suggests that the weight of a very preterm baby, following intrauterine velocity, first of all, will be lower at term than that of a baby born at term. And when coupled with stabilization along parallel centiles in all gestational age groups, our data suggests that postnatal weight gain in the third trimester in our neonatal intensive care units follows an inherent trajectory, as is the case throughout childhood. Now, some final data I hope to leave you with some thoughts, is that babies, when they freely suckle, do seem able to self-regulate their intakes. This slide is taken from a paper by Nick Embleton and Richard Cook, published some years ago in 2005. It was a small randomized controlled trial in which they were comparing isocaloric diets, 3 isocaloric diets delivering 3 different protein intakes, A, B, and C, higher, middling, and lower. And these babies were fed this from before the babies left neonatal intensive care, when they were still on nasogastric feeds, and the babies were followed until term plus 12 weeks. And following discharge, of course, the babies suckled freely. They were taking suck feeds by bottle of these diets. Now, when the babies were receiving nasogastric tube feeds, you could see that it was possible to force them to adopt different weight gain trajectories. These 3 lines diverge. But as they increasingly start to regulate their own intake, they all start to come together so that by term plus 12 weeks, regardless of the fact that they continue to be fed these 3 very different diets, they all converge at the same point, suggesting that the babies who were fed the higher protein intakes self-regulated their energy and their overall nutrient intake, and they all came back to the same place. So it's a question for us. As neonatologists, if we try and force a particular pattern of growth within our neonatal intensive care unit, does it really make any difference at all? We also have some new data that we have just submitted for publication. This is a small pilot feasibility randomized controlled trial comparing unfortified human milk, which was mother's milk plus pasteurized donor milk if there was a shortfall, or fortified human milk, so this was mother's milk plus or minus donor milk, which was fortified. And in the third group, they were fed unfortified mother's milk with preterm formula if there was a shortfall of mother's milk. And they were fed this diet from birth up to 35 weeks postmenstrual age. And we measured body composition at term and anthropometry at term, and also body composition and anthropometry at 50 weeks. And I'm just showing you the weight and the length and the head circumference, but for these anthropometric measures and for body compositional measures, we used whole body MRI to measure body composition. There was absolutely no difference at term or at 50 weeks postmenstrual age. In other words, suggesting again that these babies self-regulate their own intakes. So to end, practice recommendations. What do we know so far? Well, first of all, we should bear in mind that if a baby shows growth faltering, we should remember that it's estimated that only around half the variance in weight gain is attributable to nutritional intake. In other words, the other half of the variance are due to non-nutritional factors. These may be intercurrent illness. In pediatric practice, we know that non-organic failure to thrive exists. This is why children, for example, who are suffering abuse of various kinds will not grow. Does this translate into a message for neonatal care? I don't know, but I'm going to come on to that in a moment. But I would leave you with this message from this slide, that growth faltering tells us something is wrong. It does not tell us what is wrong. And we should resist the temptation, if we see growth faltering, to simply try and force more food into babies. We should try and reflect on whether the problem is truly nutritional inadequacy, which it may be, or whether it's because there is something wrong with the baby. Now, common causes of faltering weight gain in neonatal units are restricting feed volumes to 150 or 160 mils per kilo of human milk. It's also the exclusive use of human donor milks, particularly if you do not fortify this, because many human donor milks, pooled human donor milks, are lower nutrient density. And another common cause of growth faltering in neonatal units is chronic sodium depletion. And this will not be obvious from the serum sodium concentration, because the serum sodium concentration will remain normal in the face of chronic sodium depletion until the baby is profoundly depleted. We have large population data showing that in babies, very preterm babies fed at least 200 mils per kilo of unfortified own mother's milk, they follow a very consistent growth trajectory, and protein insufficiency appears to be rare. Some, but not all babies, are likely to benefit from fortification of human milk feeds. In the UK, less than 20% of very preterm babies receive any exogenous milk fortification. So, caution, we should first do no harm. Promoting weight gain to achieve full-term weight by term, as depicted by current preterm growth charts, might exacerbate the risks of chronic non-communicable diseases and reduced lifespan to which babies born preterm we know are already vulnerable. A primary focus for neonatal care should be to discharge a baby breastfeeding, not to discharge a baby achieving the weight of a full-term baby. And nutritional and other clinical research studies should focus on evaluating functional health and neurodevelopmental outcomes, and not growth, because we don't know what the optimum growth pattern for a very preterm baby is at the moment. And I'm going to leave you with this final thought about the nurturing neonatal unit. I've said several times during this talk that we know that non-organic failure to thrive exists in pediatric practice. We don't know whether this same entity exists in neonatal intensive care units. But we do know that very preterm babies experience prolonged periods of sensory deprivation, of pain, of isolation, and of stress of various sorts from the illnesses they suffer. Might these entities in their own right contribute to growth faltering in the neonatal intensive care unit? Does non-organic growth faltering occur in neonatal intensive care? I don't have an answer to that question, but I'm going to leave it with you. And I'm also going to say that I think it's time to rethink preterm growth charts. Growth charts should help visualize growth, but they should not be regarded as a standard. They should be regarded as a reference. They represent the reference population, and reference populations vary by location, by time, and by the diseases and the illness severity suffered by these populations. Preterm growth charts require rethinking. How might we construct new preterm growth charts in the future? Well, I've already said that the data appear to suggest that third trimester postnatal weight velocity follows a predetermined trajectory. We know that all babies, whenever they're born, preterm or full term, will, after they're born, will lose total body water. They will lose extracellular water, about 10% of extracellular water, which reflects around about roughly 6 to 8% weight loss. So after that 6 to 8% postnatal weight loss, we should then attempt to perhaps mirror intrauterine weight velocity, accepting that these curves will not converge with the growth of babies born at full term. And that means that new preterm growth charts will inevitably have a bit of a step at when they join with charts constructed from children who were born at full term. So we might then want to reassign our preterm babies to full term charts, accepting that this will be at a lower centile than the birth centile. So I'm going to end there. I hope I've given you food for thought. I've just put up this picture of some of the members of my research group, past and present, to say thank you to them for all of the research that they do. Thank you to all the babies who take part in our studies, and thank you very much for listening to this talk.
Thank you, Neena. It was really a wonderful talk, and I could not agree more on what you said. And I pass the microphone to Joe that will lead the discussion, and I'm sure there will be a lot of questions on this very controversial topic, as probably what the scenario you depicted is somewhat different than what we have heard from several years. And Joe, please, your view and your comments on this, and the audience as well.
Sure. Thank you, Neena. That was an excellent, thought-provoking lecture. I really enjoyed it. I'm going to get straight to some of the questions by the participants. And let's start with our first question. This is from our friend Cammie Martin from Boston. With regard to your 2021 data, weights with morbidity can also be confounded by practice differences due to the perception of illness and assumptions made by the clinician on tolerance of nutritional delivery during critical illness. Have you considered a mediation or propensity score analysis of this data to tease this out?
Yes, thank you very much, Kelly. And of course, you're absolutely right. And we are continuing to work on this data set. So yes, I completely agree with your comment. What we did in this initial study, which is now published, is we did just for postnatal variables. And when, for example, we examined weight at 36 weeks postmenstrual age, we did adjust for and when we were trying to construct these curves, which depicted the pattern of weight gain for the babies who survived without major morbidity, we did adjust for postnatal nutritional intake. We do have some nutritional data in our database, so we did use these data to adjust, but that was a regression-based adjustment, and we have not as yet conducted a propensity score match study. Now, one of the problems is that, of course, to get good matches, as you will know very well, is we do need very, very, very large numbers of data points. We do need very large sample sizes. So even with our 90,000 baby plus study, 45,000 of whom survived without major morbidity, we, given the variation in nutritional practice throughout the UK, we are going to be hard pushed to get a good number of matched babies, but we are trying to do that at the moment. So wish us luck. We haven't done it yet, but we do have it in our sights. And I'm as interested as all colleagues at what we will find. I don't know the answer to that at the moment, but thank you for that point.
Here's another very interesting question by Stefano Martinelli. Which biochemical markers, if any, do you use in guiding nutrition growth of extremely preterm newborns? And that I'd like to just add to that question a little bit about, in the future, is it possible that we may really be minimizing the use of growth charts and going much more toward physiologic parameters and looking at biomarkers of nutrition, adequacy of nutrition to provide some better precision than the growth charts alone?
Thank you very much. Again, two very, very important and extremely interesting questions. So let me take the first question first, and then Joe, your second question next, if I may. So in terms of, we don't have good biomarkers of nutritional adequacy. This is a great area that's ripe for much more research. The one that we use in day-to-day clinical practice, I'm not talking about research use here, I'm talking about clinical practice, is, as with many colleagues around the world, is we do monitor the blood urea. And of course, if we've got a baby who, for example, is on a good volume of mum's milk, so and it's very common for us to be giving 200 mils per kilo of mum's milk to our preterm babies. But if such a baby has got a blood urea that is falling steadily, and if it falls below 1 micromolar per liter, then certainly that is an indication for us to consider adding in a human milk fortifier, because of course, if your blood urea is that low when you're on an intake of 200 mils per kilo of human milk, it is likely that you're mopping up every single bit of protein that we're providing, and that the baby probably does need more protein. But so that is a very crude, very simple, and I think a biomarker that's used around the world. But we desperately need better biomarkers of nutritional adequacy. So Joe, your point is absolutely to the point, I think. Now I'm going to draw on a lesson learned from my community pediatric colleagues around the world. And they have over the years raised the very interesting point that although growth monitoring in community settings, and this is both in affluent as well as in low resource settings, many community pediatricians point out that the evidence for routine growth monitoring is not actually terribly good. And that they suggest that we should stop spending the huge sums of money that are spent on routine growth monitoring. And we should possibly be moving in community practice around the world to actually more careful monitoring of children's functional health, other meaningful, important health outcomes to them. Now, the community pediatricians, I think, still consider this a cause of controversy. WHO and other international organizations still advocate routine growth monitoring, but I draw this analogy in because it's very close to what you've just said, Joe, which is that maybe in the future, we should stop wasting so much time on plotting dots on a chart, and we should actually be directing our interest at actually identifying some biomarkers of nutritional adequacy. This is a great challenge to the next generation of researchers to really try and nail this.
So along similar lines, thank you, Neena. Along similar lines, there's another question here from Franz. Can we please discuss a little on the role of sodium depletion in determining failure to thrive? Has sodium a direct role on growth potential, or is it a surrogate indicator of bad nutrition?
Thank you
Is
very
there
much.
a reference paper to look for study purpose on this subject?
There are papers, and certainly my group's published a number of them. So if you search in PubMed for Modi and Preterm, Modi and Hartnell, Modi and Tang, you'll find some of these early papers. They were done in the 1990s. So these, but to answer your question, sodium is a growth promoter in its own right. Now, sodium is a prime determinant of extracellular fluid volume. If you undergo a slight contraction of your extracellular fluid volume, then you will lose weight. That's what happens when, for example, you're dehydrated. But sodium in our preterm babies in the growing subject is also a growth promoter. And if you're chronically sodium, and this goes back to animal studies done way back in the 1970s and 80s, showing very clearly that animals fed isocaloric diets, but different sodium intakes, not only had a difference in growth during the period of sodium restriction, but that growth decline was continued after their sodium balance was restored to normal. In other words, that you can affect the longitudinal growth by a short, sharp period of sodium depletion. So this is why it's important that our very preterm babies do get an adequate sodium intake. And again, I don't mean too high sodium intake, nor do I mean a too low sodium intake. I mean a right sodium intake somewhere in the middle. And I also made the point that if a baby is chronically sodium depleted, lots of our babies are on diuretics, lots of our babies are on xanthines, all of this is going to promote sodium loss. Human milk has got a very low sodium intake, and very preterm babies do not conserve sodium as well. So for a number of different reasons, they are very much at risk of chronic sodium depletion. Now, if a baby is chronically sodium depleted, you will not see this if you just measure the blood electrolytes, because the blood electrolytes will remain normal until the bitter end. They will only suddenly decline when the baby is profoundly sodium depleted. So simply measuring serum electrolytes will not tell you anything about whether a baby is chronically sodium depleted. So you have to be alert to this possibility. And you have to ask yourself, if your baby is being fed unfortified human milk, and they're getting a very decent volume, like 200 mils per kilo, and their blood urea isn't falling, and yet they're not growing, and they are well and healthy, they don't have any intercurrent illness, and yet their centiles are falling, that should be a trigger to you, the clinician, to say, might this be chronic sodium depletion? So again, it's about clinical judgment.
So Neena, do you think that urine sodium measurements may have some benefit in this measurement?
They may, but very often, unfortunately, as you know, Joe, they don't, because of course, if a baby's on diuretics, that's going to distort the urinary sodium concentration and make it difficult to interpret. And also, if you've got a baby, particularly in the, if you've got an extremely preterm baby, they may have a very marked inability to conserve sodium, which might give you a falsely high sodium, urinary sodium concentration, even though they are sodium depleted. However, if you're thinking about a more mature, very preterm baby, you know, once you get to a postmenstrual age of around 32, 33, 34 weeks postmenstrual age, then the urinary sodium can be quite useful, particularly if the baby is not on diuretics. And an extremely low urinary sodium concentration is, again, going to convince, I think you should rely on clinical judgment first, but if you then measure that urinary sodium concentration, it might give you some corroborative evidence that, yes, this baby is sodium depleted. And if you cannot measure a sodium concentration, a urinary sodium concentration, it doesn't matter, because if your clinical judgment tells you that the baby is sodium depleted, you can just give them a 1 to 2 millimole per kilo per day oral sodium supplement and see what happens. If the baby suddenly starts to gain weight fantastically and you haven't changed anything else, then it is telling you that this baby was almost certainly sodium depleted. If the baby doesn't suddenly gain weight rapidly, then it's telling you the converse, that this baby is unlikely to be sodium depleted. So again, it comes back to, I think, pulling together all of the knowledge that we have as clinicians and putting it together with your clinical judgment.
Yeah, so here's another good question. Thank you again for that excellent answer, Neena. Here's another good question that I think is very pertinent here. And this is from Prakash Menikoff. And, you know, obviously, we would like to be able to have a known personalized optimal growth for every single individual baby, but we don't have that. And so we're relying on these Gaussian statistics and growth curves. And so the question here is, which is more harmful, faster growth or slower growth?
Both.
Both. Okay.
And this is what I said. We somehow, as a global neonatal community, have got to stop swinging to the extremes. Clearly, we do not want to starve our babies. We don't want them to grow too slowly. Obviously, we don't want to do that. Many of us have come from a generation when we were practicing in the 1980s, the 1990s, when our babies were not growing well at all. We do not want to go back to those days, but nor do we want to promote fatter, faster growing babies when there's a real risk that this is going to store up or exacerbate problems for them in the future. Just because we wave goodbye to them at the door of the neonatal unit does not mean that we, I think, as clinicians, as of various sorts, that we are not concerned about their futures. Of course we are. And so we should think about first doing no harm. And we've got to work out how to steer this very, very sensitive and important tightrope between feeding them too much and feeding them too little.
Thank you. Here's another excellent question. This is from Yahil Osorio. If you do not use human milk fortification, how do you cover vitamin D and calcium and phosphorus daily requirements?
Thank you very much. Again, that's a question I'm asked a lot, and it's a really important question. So when I say no fortification, or fortification is not routinely practiced in the UK, I mean macronutrient fortification. All our very preterm babies will receive phosphate supplements. So and phosphate depletion is the primary cause of metabolic bone disease of prematurity. So they will all very preterm babies who are on human milk feeds will receive phosphate supplements. They will all receive vitamin supplements. They will only receive calcium supplements if they appear to need it, because not all of them require additional calcium supplements. But phosphate is routine and vitamins are routine.
Okay, excellent. Here's another question from our friend Ricardo Davanzo. Which is the importance, the most important, while interpreting the etiology of growth failure in a tube-fed preterm, of uncompleted expression of breast milk by a mother producing plenty of milk, thus providing milk of low caloric density to her baby?
Ah, right, yes, yeah. So again, an important point to thank you very, very much. So milk, yes, you know, as they say, pudding comes afterwards, dessert comes afterwards. So the hind milk has got a higher fat content and a higher energy content. And sure, if your baby, if you're limited to the volumes that you can give and you want to provide preferentially hind milk, then of course, yes, you can do that. Don't forget, most mothers though will try and undertake a complete expression, and that complete expression will then be put in a bottle and given to the baby as appropriate. So I would encourage you, if you've got expressing mums, for the mum to do a complete expression. The other thing I would say is that do not leave milk sitting in plastic tubing for a long period of time, because again, we all know that can reduce the the energy content because of adherence of fat to the plastic tubing. So a complete expression, and do not leave the human milk in contact with plastic tubing for prolonged periods of time.
Thank you. I have several comments just saying how great a talk it was. And one of them is from our friend Nick Embleton, who says, great talk and thank you. We all agree, and he also says, we all agree that there are inadequate data for optimal growth. Growth is a marker, not an outcome, and optimizing nutritional status is what we are all after. If we don't use growth studies, how else can we best determine optimal nutrient intakes? In practice, NICUs have to feed to some sort of target. So what should that target be? Well,
we don't know, do we? And Nick, it's good. I can't see you, unfortunately, but it's good to know that you're out there. And all of you, I think, this is not my research group, but all of you have been involved in various ways in evaluating biomarkers for good nutritional adequacy. And as I said in my response to one of the first questions that came in, this is a really important area of research. Tanis, I quoted your work as well, because I think it was great that you actually published these data showing the poor predictive value of anthropometry at term in relation to future neurodevelopmental outcome. I mean, I think, Nick, and you and I have discussed this on many an occasion, I think that nutritional trials should have as their primary outcomes functional measures of health, neurodevelopment, and in due course, even cardiovascular well-being, and so on and so forth. And there are biomarkers of good cardiovascular development. What their predictive value are in the very preterm population for long-term cardiac outcomes, well, the data, as you know very well, is still very, very, very limited indeed. But this is why I must put this in. This is why my research group has been so keen to ensure that we can establish a database that enables follow-up of children throughout their life course. Because without ability to marry together early growth patterns with long-term health outcomes, we are never going to get at an answer to the question of does early growth pattern, and I think this is the research question, does the pattern of early postnatal growth predict long-term outcomes? And
thank you, Nina. This is a very extremely important issue.
And Virgilio, I know you have done work on this area too, excellent work on this area. And the more of us, I think, who are doing these long-term studies and trying to pool our data, and the longer we're able to follow up our children, the closer we will get to being able to provide an answer to these questions, which at the moment are just unanswerable.
There are many more questions, Nina, but I think we're running out of time. I have to say thank you so much for this very stimulating talk. You always make us think, and this is so important, and this keeps us humble. And we need to remain that way to continue to make progress in this field. So again, thank you very much. And if there's no other comments or questions from other people, I think we have to end here.
Thank you very much, Joe. Thank you all very much for inviting me to take part in Hippocrates.
Thank you all, and thank you all. And we see each other tomorrow at the same time, 2 p.m. for EC Fenton. He's going to talk on early growth and outcome. And I expect you tomorrow with as many people as we had today. Thank you again. Bye.
Thank you, all of you. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.